Welcome back, class, to Media Appreciation, TVRA 134, and today we'll be starting on Chapter 3, Newspapers. So, good job of turning in your assignment yesterday. Assignment meaning paper number 1, your media log and paper. So remember, when you are turning in your assignments and in the future, do a header with your name, the paper name, the course name, and date is what we're looking for in this. So going forward, that's what we are looking for. We will be having 4 online tests plus a final. The final will be optional. Online tests are less stressful at times because you'll be doing them at home, but they can be tricky. Start a day or so early in case you have technical problems. Tests are open book, open notes, but timed. So you still have to study 1 to 3 hours, 4 if you have not kept up week by week. Okay. So mass communication, the process of designing and delivering cultural messages and stories to diverse audiences through media channels as old as the book and as new as the internet. Human beings have always valued news, the process by which people gather information and create narrative reports to help one another make sense of events happening around them. Americans have this need to know whether they want coverage of politics, exposés on business, corruption, or current events, and humorous stories. So here's a question I'm posing. Are newspapers mass media? So the first newspaper, Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, was published on September 25th by Benjamin Harris in Boston, Massachusetts. It was banned after 1 issue for its negative view of British rule. So this was around 1690, and we were still under British rule at that time. Another paper that became very famous was Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, one of the best colonial papers. Let's not forget about John Peter Zenger, printer of the paper, and his paper, the New York Weekly Journal, which criticized the governor of New York. Zenger was arrested for seditious libel when one of his writers defamed a public official's character in print. His lawyer, you may have heard of him, Alexander Hamilton, won his case and helped lay the foundation for the First Amendment to the Constitution adopted as part of the Bill of Rights in 1791. The right of the democratic press to criticize public officials. So early America had few newspapers, publishing was slow and expensive, and news was slower. Expectations were even lower, so set the bar low. Also, before the Bill of Rights, free speech was not a guarantee. Imagine that. Newspapers were political vehicles in the formation of our nation and were not always objective. Mass newspapers could not exist without an efficient printing press and a large literate audience. So last chapter we talked about Gutenberg and his printing press and how it was important for the audience to become able to read and write, or otherwise known as literate. Okay, here's just a little comic. You could just take a look at this. Every morning before my eyes even focus all the way, I read a bunch of infuriating national news stories and bad opinions. I wonder what this is doing to my brain. Probably not great. And the mom says, back in my day, we had to pay people to print out infuriating news stories and bring them to our door, and we waited until we'd stumbled out to the kitchen to read them. Totally different. The daughter says, okay, fair, but newspapers at least had more local news mixed in, right? And mom says, yes, that is true. I bet they weren't full of bad opinions. Yes, all of our opinions were good, but it was a remarkable time. Please don't go check. So, similar, changing a little bit. Now we may not read our news in a paper newspaper. We might read our news from a newspaper, but in an online format, a digital format. So let's talk a little bit about Nellie Bly. In 1887, a young reporter left her job at the Pittsburgh Dispatch to seek her fortune in New York City. Only 23 years old, Elizabeth Pink Cochran wanted to have her byline on the front page. She was tired of just writing on the society pages and answering letters to the editor, which is what most women in those days were only allowed to do, was write for society pages and things like that. They weren't allowed to write the hard news. At that time, it was considered unladylike for a woman to use her real name. So she used the name Nellie Bly from a Stephen Foster song. She earned a tryout at Pulitzer's New York World, the nation's largest paper. Her assignment was to investigate the conditions at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell Island. She wandered the streets, acting strangely and unwashed. She was committed to the asylum and was declared mentally deranged. So and then she was actually sent to this institution, committed to the institution, or insane asylum, as they called them in those days. After 10 days, she was let out, and the story she wrote was called Sensational. It was a first-person account of what women went through in that asylum. Okay, and here's a question I'm posing to you. Newspapers are protected and are required in a democracy. Do you agree or disagree with that? Newspapers are the only media practice or business specifically protected by the U.S. Constitution. Well, when the Constitution was written, things like the internet were not even invented yet. So, okay. So here's an example of a front page of a newspaper. This is an online version of the Washington Post, which you've probably seen, at least heard of in our area. This is our main newspaper in Washington, D.C., although there are many. But you can see at the top there's something called a masthead. That's the title of the newspaper. You will see there's a date. There's a little bit of forecast of weather. And then there are different topics that you can choose, different stories, titles that you can go to watch to look at what you would like to read about. So here's a lady I'd like you to know more about, Katharine Graham. So Catherine Meyer Graham was born in June 16th of 1917. She passed away July 17th of 2001. She was an American publisher and the second female publisher of a major American newspaper, following Eliza Jane Nicholson's ownership of the New Orleans Daily Picayune. She led her family's newspaper, the Washington Post, for more than 2 decades, overseeing the most famous period. And that period included Watergate, coverage that eventually led to the resignation of President Nixon, and in her memoir, Personal History, that won her a Pulitzer Prize in 1998. So what was the Watergate scandal, you might ask? Some of you might know, but if you don't, the Watergate scandal was a major American political scandal that lasted from 1972 to 1974, following a burglary by 5 men of the Democratic National Committee, DNC headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., back in 1972, and President Nixon's subsequent attempt to cover up his administration's involvement. After the 5 burglars were caught and the conspiracy was discovered, chiefly through work of few journalists, congressional staffers, and election finance watchdog official, Watergate was investigated by the U.S. Congress. So this led to a constitutional crisis, and the term Watergate has become to encompass an array of clandestine and often illegal activities undertaken by members of the Nixon administration. Those activities included dirty tricks like bugging the offices of political opponents and people of whom Nixon or his officials were suspicious. Nixon and his close aides also ordered investigations of activist groups and political figures using the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, and the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the IRS, which is the Internal Revenue Service, as political weapons. Okay, So here we have the olden times, the world's oldest newspaper. So let's talk about, and this isn't the actual oldest newspaper, this is just something we've made up for class. We've put it on some old parchment looking paper here to give us the idea of an ancient publication. So when the First Amendment was signed into law, it brought about many, many changes to our country. So the Jacksonian age. In most cases, society has to be ready for technological advances. Printing presses, literacy, and social change had to take place. These were the days when ordinary people were first recognized as a political and economic force, and mass market newspapers grew with the rise of an urban middle class. So the penny press. This idea was started by Benjamin Day, publisher of the New York Sun, and he charged only 1 cent, or penny, a copy, and the competition was 6 cents. Others soon followed Day's formula for success. So the first penny papers became popular, and change too was reading those papers and how papers were written. So since they only cost 1 cent, more people were able to afford these. Benjamin Day founded this New York Sun, and their logo was "It Shines for All." It highlighted local events, scandals, and police reports, made legends of people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, trailblazing Americans' need for celebrity news. So in those days, those were our celebrities. Human interest stories were the success for penny papers, news accounts that focused on daily trials and triumphs of the human condition, often featuring ordinary individuals who had faced extraordinary challenges. So it shifted the economic support for the paper from subscribers to advertisers. Now advertisers were becoming more important. It changed the pattern of distribution, vendors, and street sales, changed the focus of what constituted news. So day focused content on local happenings, sex, violence, and human interest stories, and people were hired to seek out newsworthy stories. And here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. So, a brief history of newspapers. Let's talk about the inverted pyramid. So think about the shape of a pyramid. And then think about inverting that pyramid so that the wide part is at the top. So the most important news goes at the top of a story. The who, what, when, where, why, and sometimes how at the top of the story, and then narrowed it down to less significant details. The main or first sentence is called the lead, and it's the most valuable piece of information in any given news story. It's up to the gatekeeper to determine the lead. News writers started the practice of leading with most important information way back when the telegraph lines were often threatened and sometimes only the first part of a message got through. This is still a common practice in news writing. So some of the first or pioneers that changed the newspaper business. Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. He stressed accuracy and reserved more space for ads, which was called the news hole. His paper used illustrations and sensationalism to sell copies, and that was called yellow journalism. Pulitzer was born into a wealthy family of Magyar Jewish origin in Mako, Hungary in 1847, and his father was a grain merchant, retired in Budapest, and Joseph grew up and was educated there in private schools by tutors. And we are about out of time here. We will switch to the next recording momentarily.